See, all the civilizations that you have in the world, they are built on certain codes. They are built on certain essential principles. And within the confines of those codes, the play of civilizational change or cultural change happens. Christianity of Christendom is not divorced from the Greco-Roman world. It was the re-entry of Aristotle through the Middle Eastern world which led to the emergence of Renaissance in the Western world.
Namaste. Welcome to another episode of IKS Changemakers, an Indica podcast. This is Shivakumar, your host, serving and nurturing IKS Changemakers at Indica. In this podcast, we bring you people, their thought and their work, which is essentially Dharma in action through Indian knowledge systems. Our IKS Changemaker today is Professor Kundan Singh, Professor at Sofia University, Palo, Alto, California. He is also the President of Cultural Integration Fellowship at San Francisco. He is also a Senior Fellow at Hindupedia. Today, we are going to discuss an interesting subject, Binaries in the Western Civilization and Bharat. This is also a part of his new book, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. Hope you enjoy this exploration of binaries and the need to transcend them. Namaste, Professor Kundan Singh, and welcome to you once again for our podcast, IKS Changemakers.
Namaste, Shivakumar.
Namaste.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a pleasure and honor to have you here. And I have with me this new book, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, a Francophone post-colonial analysis which you have co-authored with Krishna Maheshwari. This book is available for people to download and read it. Today, we will discuss a particular chapter, and in that, some specific elements that are of deep consequence to us as a culture and civilization and the way forward. Let me take this opportunity, Professor, and introduce the need to discuss this specific chapter or the set of concepts that we want to discuss, focusing on binaries. On the one hand, this book is about James Mill and the distortions he introduced to the Indic discourse, which have survived till today. On the other hand, it is a zoom in, zoom out into the colonial discourse itself. But more importantly, while it explains the colonial discourse, it also explains a feature of the Western civilization and its corresponding counterpart in India, which you have beautifully captured in the fourth chapter. That is, why does James Mill look at India the way he looks at it? Is it a consequence of the colonial ambition of British India? Is it the consequence of Mill's own personal ambition? Or is it the consequence of certain lens provided to him by the Western civilization and its thought process itself, which is somewhat inconsistency with what Professor Bharagangadhara has laid out in his Heathen in His Blindness as well, because the West looks at India the way it does because that is how that is its learning configuration. And within that context, you have stated that the Western civilization operates in binaries, good, bad, soul, body, and you have narrated a list of binaries that it operates in, and sometimes it privileges one, sometimes it privileges other. So there is a seesaw dynamic going along, and rest of the world is explained through one of the two elements of the binary. This is in summary, how it is relevant to James Mill's colonial deconstruction. So let me read out the first theorem in that context. Given that simple binaries like right, wrong, and true, false did not get transcended in the Western cosmology beginning with the Greeks, various binaries like soul/body, this world/other world, contemplation/practical know-how, being/becoming, reason/senses, among others, within the Western paradigm got created. This is an important realization, and you the way you formulate it is that these binaries will always exist. It's only the transcendence that did not exist. That is the assertion of this statement. So can you elaborate on this? Because what does it mean in the context of how has this operated in the Western civilization? Before we even come to India, we need to understand that.
Thank you, Shivakumarji. So, addressing your first question with regards to James Mill, all the three factors that you enumerated were operational on James Mill. I categorize them as paradigm of arrogance and paradigm of ignorance. Paradigm of arrogance is when ego to dominate is consciously operational. Paradigm of ignorance is when one unconsciously projects. Within the Indian system of thought, they are not disparate once again. They are interconnected. There isn't any binary. I will explain that as the conversation unfolds. So in order to write this book, I started with post-colonial francophone thinkers. But when I came to chapter 4, I developed my own theory, Indian Post-Colonial Theory, which transcends and integrates the writings of the francophone post-colonial thinkers like Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. They are also true to how the Indian people have operated since antiquity. I have not created a binary. I have transcended and integrated the binary. I have taken the thoughts of these three post-colonial thinkers and taken them to a whole different level. Now, coming back to this theorem that we are talking about, and this is about civilizational differences between India and the West. Here also, when I talk about the difference, I am not situating the difference in binaries, but I am going to enumerate the characteristics of both the civilizations, which has come to me through a deep study of both the civilizations by going into the philosophies of both the traditions. Not only the philosophies, I should say, but also epistemologies, which is the theory of knowledge. So, when you look at the Indian darshana systems, there are commonalities and similarities amongst them. Today when we talk about Buddhism and Vedanta, for instance, people only talk about dissimilarities. But there are similarities as well. The first thing that we need to recognize is that in terms of metaphysical matters, Buddha did not say anything. He did not utter a word. He kept quiet. He kept mum. Right? So we are talking about later Buddhism and Vedanta. When you compare later Buddhism with Vedanta, what is it that you find? You find that there is a difference in ontology. What is ontology for your viewers? Theory of being. Vedanta talks about Brahma. It talks about Atma. It says that Brahma and Atma are one and the same. In English terms, it talks about self with a capital S. Later Buddhism denies it. It denies the existence of self with a capital S. And in the process, it denies both Atma as well as Brahma. It denies Purusha. This is the difference. So, there is a categorical difference between later Buddhism and Vedanta in terms of ontology. Where is the similarity? The similarity is in epistemology. Once again, for the viewers, these words, though they sound complicated, are very, very simple in the sense that epistemology is how do you know what you know? I repeat, how do you know what you know? In essential terms, epistemology talks about subject and object. Now, when you look at the epistemology of both Vedanta and Buddhism, transcendence of dualities and dichotomies, which we call as binaries in contemporary discourse, becomes a must. Why is it a must? Because both these traditions say that mind operates in binaries. Mind operates in dichotomies and dualities. And there are realms of consciousness that are beyond your mind. They have to be experienced in order to experience deeper reality or the ultimate truth. Buddhism, later Buddhism and Vedanta may differ in the description of that ultimate reality, but they both recognize some sort of an ultimate reality. And in order to get to that ultimate reality, the transcendence of dichotomies and dualities are a must. And they take a very simple exercise. The usual mind thinks that true is true, false is false, right is right, wrong is wrong.
Civilized is civilized, savage is savage.
Yes. Day is day, night is night, and so on and so forth. These traditions say that once you take out one, the other also disappears. Think about this. We usually don't think about this, but I would request everyone to think about this. If you take day out, night also disappears.
If you take civilized out, the savage disappears.
Savage disappears. If you take true out, false also disappears. If you take right away, wrong also goes away. Which basically means that right and wrong, true and false, day and night, mountains and valleys are not mutually exclusive categories but are mutually interdependent categories. This simplistic understanding, interestingly, is not very common. And beginning with this kind of a discourse, and both these traditions, they go very, very deep into things. I don't want to bore your readers with that. But what they emphasize is that dichotomies and dualities must be transcended. They must be gone past in order to experience the deeper realities. Now, it is this. I gave you the example from Buddhism and Vedanta, but these examples are in all our yogic literature, spanning whatever tradition you may want to pick. It is all pervasive. And that is why I say that transcendence, well, I should not say transcendence alone. It is transcendence and integration of binaries, which distinguishes the Indian civilization from the Western civilization, given its emphasis that you find in our darshana systems, in our literature. Now, the Western civilization, instead of transcending binaries, has actually operated in binaries. It has operated in strict dichotomies and dualities, and this is what, the first theorem captures.
Yeah. I was actually about to come to that. That is, we can reasonably say that if there is no transcendence, then binary and operating in the binary becomes the prominent paradigm. And you probably create more binaries and triumph in operating them. And operating in binaries means that you associate yourselves with one and constantly problematize the other. And that's why James Mill is probably the exemplary in this. The entire ecosystem of intellectuals and scholars, who have come to India in that period, have triumphed in binaries and have othered India, associating it with one of the binaries in a strong manner. Can we reasonably say that this othering and problematizing the other is an essential aspect of the binary, because you can still say that X and Y are binaries, but you can ignore Y while being in the X. But a binary operation always results in X problematizing the Y and creating a conflict with the Y. Is conflict an inherent feature of the binarization?
See, I would say that once you recognize that binaries have not been transcended, then there are certain patterns that are operational in Western cosmology. And those patterns have to be recognized. And those are the patterns that I have captured or encapsulated in other binary theorems. See, the Western civilization is a march of a very long time period. The colonization of non-European cultures happened much later. It has traversed the time period, or let me put it this way, it has traversed a certain time period before it started colonizing others. So I would say that before we come to James Mill or other thinkers, it is important to recognize other patterns of binary operation which I have captured in other theorems.
So let's move to the second theorem, Professor. Theorem 2. As the civilization progressed, more binaries were created. For instance, the lack of transcendence of dualisms in the Greek world, like soul, body, this world, other world, contemplation, practical know-how, being, becoming, reason, senses, so now we see more, gave birth to rationalism, empiricism, subjectivism/objectivism, faith/reason, religion/science, enlightenment/romanticism, idealism/realism, rationalism/positivism, rationalism/existentialism, and so on. So this means that once you have this core tenet in the civilization of operating in the binaries, then there is a constant production of the binary, because by the virtue of humanity having to do something, you will keep on creating things, and you will constantly create things and then build binaries around them, because no two things can be the same. So that's an interesting proposition here. So binaries create binaries, and then you will constantly create an othering between the two. So the critical question here is that, are there other factors impacting this, or just the very absence of transcendence and integration results in this dynamic?
See, when you look at the binaries and their operation in Western systems of thought, what is it that you're essentially doing? You are essentially getting into the mind of the Western civilization. You are trying to understand how the Western civilization operates. See, all the civilizations that you have in the world, they are built on certain codes. They are built on certain essential principles. And within the confines of those codes, the play of civilizational change or cultural change happens. For instance, when you try and understand the codes of the Indian civilization, you'll find emphasis on transcendence of binaries. Similarly, lack of transcendence of binaries is an essential feature of the Western civilization. And within this lack, the play of culture has happened over a period of time. So the Western civilization will not operate in any different way, because it is going to follow its dharma or its swadharma. Its swadharma, its civilizational swadharma, is determined by binaries. It cannot escape it. And that is why, as the civilization progresses and moves forward, it keeps creating binaries and different binaries. It cannot escape that. It's part of its DNA. It's part of its mental frame. It is part of its swadharma. And this is not a matter of criticism. It is a matter of recognizing what the civilization is all about. There are cultural and civilizational differences across the world. And when you engage in this study, you get to realize certain differences, certain essential differences within which, I'm emphasizing this, within which the change happens. So I'm not essentializing, this description. What I'm also saying, as I'm transcending the binary, that within the confines of this larger category, change happens.
Understood. So actually, now I'll come to a associated question towards the end, but I'll raise it now. We are right now at this moment, we are creating another binary, that is a civilization that has transcendence and a civilization that does not have transcendence. What does transcendence mean between these two binaries is a question that we have to answer at some point in time. We may or may not be ready at this stage, but we will have to answer, because finally, harmony between the West and the East is a function of whether we can transcend this also or not. But we'll come to this later. We'll move to the
But
next.
that is an important perspective. See, while I was talking about the difference, right, I am not operating in binaries. Why? Because I am not privileging one
Over the other.
over the other, and that takes us right into Theorem 3, which becomes very important as far as the operation of binaries is concerned.
Yes. So we'll do this, and we'll park this question, to explore a little bit towards the end. Theorem 3. When binaries are not transcended, in every binary divide, one half of the binary gets privileged and the other half gets suppressed. It's a prophetic statement. For instance, during Christendom, in the faith-reason binary, faith was privileged and the reason suppressed. In the religion-science binary, religion was privileged and the science was suppressed. We have seen this. In the soul/body binary, the soul was privileged and the body was suppressed. In the soul-body binary, the soul was privileged and the body was suppressed. In the God/world and God/earth binaries, God was privileged and the world and the earth were suppressed. The Ihapara integration we see in our culture. In the tradition/modern binary, the tradition was privileged and any modern innovation was suppressed. In the sacred profane, believer, pagan and the monotheism, polytheism binaries, sacred, believer and monotheism were privileged and profane, pagan, polytheism were suppressed. In the Enlightenment, in the binary of religion/science, science was privileged and the religion suppressed. So on and so forth, it keeps on going. So, I'll not read the complete thing. So fundamentally, privileging one and suppressing the other is the nature of operating in the binary. Thus, you can safely say that James Mill created the binary, or I'm using James Mill as a representation of the entire colonial phenomenon, where he created a binary between civilized and savaged, and it was not very difficult to privilege the civilized and the savaged. Now, this is how James Mill's discourse gets generated, and this is the psychology with which this happens. But here there is an important thing. You said that one gets privileged and the other gets suppressed. One can understand in soul body. But a binary such as civilized and savage, is it even possible, for the savage to get privileged? So is this dynamic of, is the binary creation, neutral and anything can get privileged? Or is there a bias in the binary creation itself where, it is very obvious that one gets privileged? So we need to reflect upon this a bit.
Very good question. So yes, it is true that in the writings of James Mill, in the binary of civilized versus savage, civilized got privileged, savage got suppressed. And in his writings, the English people, the British people, and the European people were civilized, and the Indian people, the Hindu people, were savage. He is completely clear about this distinction. Within this binary of civilized and savage, you will very clearly see which population is getting privileged in representation and which population is getting suppressed in representation. James Mill has written 7 chapters on the Hindus, and those 7 chapters amply describe this description. Now coming to the second part of your question. Yes, the savage also has been privileged, but not in the writings of James Mill. Savage has been privileged in the writings of Romantics and German Romantics in particular, where there was this term that was used called noble savages. So there are a host of thinkers within the Western civilization who have privileged noble savages. They have uplifted the savagery of the colonized people. In order to discuss this more, we have to come to Theorem 7, which is much later. That way, we will be able to describe the differences that exist amongst the European thinkers as they encounter the other. In the Western world, the othering interesting also operates on binaries. There's a nuance over there as well. But in order to discuss that, we have to come to Theorem 7, but we should not jump the sequence. Yes. We should go to Theorem 4, and then I will shed more light on this when we come to
Theorem 7.
Theorem
Yes,
7.
yes. Yes, I think the other associated question that I had was, is there any sense of neutrality between the binaries at all in the Western civilization, in the sense that nature of the conflict is such that the word you have used the word suppressed, right? Yeah. But suppression can happen in multiple ways. You do not give a privileged space. That is one form of suppression. The other form of suppression is far more brutal, where you earn the right to exploit the suppressed for your own betterment in whatever directions that you seek to do according to your own purpose of life and the perspective of life. So, is the nature of the suppression that comes from this binarization neutral and merely psychological and narrative oriented, or is the binarization lending itself for a very human exploitation, where you stand on the backs of the suppressed? How does this binarization psychology, operate in reality in the civilization, on the ground?
Yeah. That space of neutrality that you're talking about is non-existent. And this was institutionalized by Aristotle, who gave the law of excluded middle. So just imagine a spectrum, right? The spectrum is spread around a polarity, right? There's a space from here to here. what did Aristotle do through his law of excluded middle? He took out this space completely. This led to a collapse of the spectrum, right? And with the collapse of the spectrum, you find polarities and binaries.
So there is a face-off.
Always. Always. There is a slight nuance to this which has been captured in Theorem 5, but we'll come to that later. I just want to make one point. The problem of binaries, the operation of binaries, have existed before Aristotle as well. Aristotle institutionalized the operation of binaries. This is a critical difference that we need to underline and emphasize.
So this is important because the general perception is that it is in the Abrahamic thought, aka Christianity and Islam, where the binaries operate in the most fearsome manner. But there seems to be some contribution from the Greek world as well into this. This is a line of thought that I haven't seen, in any of our intellectuals. So I think you have added to this discourse on the binaries. Although people don't use the word binary, there is this notion of othering that is constantly explored. But its source is always located in the Abrahamic religious universe. But its contribution from the Greco-Roman world also needs to be explored, probably, as you have rightly said. Absolutely. If Aristotle has cut off the middle space, yes, the Madhyama space, yeah, then there is a significant contribution from that world as well into this generation of this conflict.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Christianity of Christendom is not divorced from the Greco-Roman world. There are scholars who have worked on the influence of Plato and Plotinus on Christianity of Christendom. So there is a connection there. Now, in terms of the Islamic world, after Plato and Plotinus got privileged in Greek thought, which was appropriated by the Christian thought, which led to the suppression of the Aristotelian thought. The Aristotelian thought flowed into the Middle Eastern world, and it was preserved for a very long period of time before it entered Europe back again during Renaissance. Or let me put it this way, that it was the re-entry of Aristotle through the Middle Eastern world which led to the emergence of Renaissance in the Western world. So this is something, which is not commonly known, but it was the Middle Eastern world which preserved the Aristotelian thought for many centuries before it was absorbed back into the Western world.
So this is interesting, and this is a productive contribution because it adds a new dimension to this discourse of understanding how these binaries and the associated cultural civilizational engagement has evolved. But we'll wait for that for another day. Right now we are in the middle space, that is yes. Theorem 4.
Yes. And we must not exclude the binaries.
Yes. When binaries have not been, I'm now reading the Theorem 4. Yes. When binaries have not been transcended, and when revolutions happen, they tend to invert the various binary cards present before the revolution. So we kind of touched upon it in terms of why one gets privileged and how the other gets privileged. So here you are. For instance, the Renaissance began reversing the different binaries ossified in Christendom, God slash world, religion slash science. So now it's time for the science to be privileged over the religion, faith slash reason, contemplation slash practical know-how, and so on and so forth. Interesting, when it's talk about contemplation slash practical know-how, a Chaturvarya system has always privileged both contemplation and practical know-how. So I guess our transcendence is also there in Chaturvarnya. The end of the Renaissance resulted in enlightenment, which led to the triumph of reason over faith, which is, we all very well know, the world over God, science over religion, and so on and so forth. This happens in two oppositional philosophies or philosophical orientations as well. For example, in the binary divide of rationalism versus empiricism, the philosophy of rationalism, as it privileges itself, undermines the philosophy of empiricism. Similarly, the philosophy of empiricism, which when it makes a case for itself, inverts the binary cart, and as it privileges itself, suppresses or undermines rationalism. This is precisely what happened when positivism came to the fore in the 1920s. Some binaries, however, will transfer untouched from one period to another, or from one philosophy or thinker to another. For instance, the man-woman binary, in which the man was privileged over the woman, transferred unmitigated from Christendom to Renaissance to Enlightenment to Romanticism, till the feminist movement began critically examining this binary and the suppression of women at the hands of men. So it's a fantastic theorem. It's a paragraph that reads beautifully, that also tells me how Bharatiya Parampara is not caught in this. As you earlier said, it is the mind that operates in this binary. And the dynamic of privileging one over the other comes only when the mind is operating in this binary. And we see in our Itihasa Puranas, society will operate in this binary, but something happens and the society transcends that binary. Its roots also we see. For instance, Asuras and Devatas who seem to be binary, but they constantly go back to Parabrahma, and at that time they are equals. And they all are children of Rishi Kashyapa. At that moment they are still equal. So, while we recognize this binary, tracing them to the same source is the way we have overcome this binary. Can we make that statement? What is it in the Eastern civilizations that it's not that we don't have the man and woman binary. It's not that we don't have reason slash faith binary, science slash religion binary. There is a binary space accorded, but we still tie them together in a larger universe.
I wouldn't take that discussion that far. I would say that yes, binaries are present. Are Western binaries present in our system? Maybe not. Yes, there is a binary of Dharma and Adharma.
It's a critical point.
Yes.
The nature of our binaries is different.
Yeah, that also is different. There is binary of Dharma and Adharma. There is a binary of, Devas and Asuras. There is a binary of Ravan and Ram, right? But as you rightly pointed out, these binaries get resolved at a higher level. Ravana and Ram are both worshippers of Lord Shiva, right? Devas and Asuras are children of the Divine Mother, performing different things, doing different things in the world.
And they had to do Samudra Manthana together.
Yes, they have to do the Samudra Manthan together, and in the Manthan, Vish also comes out, Amrit also comes out.
What fascinates me is that the entire Bharatavamsha has finally descended from an Asura woman, which is Sharmishtha. There too, at the root, there is some kind of a transcendence.
Yeah. So, there is not a single way in which binaries get transcended. And I also need to make this point that we cannot say that there are no binaries in the Indian system of thought, because the moment you say that, you have fallen into the trap of creating a binary for your own civilization. So, there will be times when there will be strict binaries. There will be times when the binaries will be dissolved. There will be times when the binary halves will be put on a spectrum. There will be times when binaries will be transcended and included. So what happens is that when you start going beyond binaries, you enlarge the scope of how you are going to work with the binaries. For instance, within the Indian system of thought, yes, there is man and woman. That is there. The classification is there. However, there are three gunas coming from the Sankhyas and discussed in the Gita that are working on men and women, which is creating, complexities within the man-woman gender. Interestingly, when feminism gets discussed within the Indian context, these complexities are not taken into account.
True.
So I always try to make this point that even when we are discussing Western concerns within our Indian context, the Indian context or the Indian complexities have to be taken into account. They must be taken into account. And that can only happen if we understand our cosmology properly. How do we understand our cosmology? By looking at our darshana systems, by seeing the interconnections that exist amongst our darshana systems, by seeing the similarities and differences that exist amongst our darshana systems. So when a study of this nature is taken into account, we tend to develop the right knowledge, the right wherewithal to discuss our modern problems from our own distinct cosmological, ontological, or epistemological perspective.
Superb. So that we touched upon the Theorem 5 to some extent.
No, that is important
but
one.
We will elaborate that.
Yes.
Theorem 5. Until binaries are transcended, the possibility of the two halves of the binary relating to each other in any way other than dialectical terms is foreclosed. I think this is the most important theorem. That is, so for the sake of our viewers, I'll just elaborate it a little bit. If we consider man/woman as a binary, then until they are transcended, until we have the notion of Parabrahman, any possibility of the two halves relating to each other in any way other than the dialectical terms, that is reciprocal relationship, is foreclosed. So there is conflict.
No. This is a different one. So let me explore on this. When I talk about the dialectical relationship between two binary halves, I am talking about the dialectics that exist in the thought of Hegel, Marx, and so on and so forth. So, what is this dialectic, that I'm talking about? Let me explain that through some examples. There is this subject-object, subjectivism, objectivism binary within the Western world, right? Objectivism has been privileged for the longest period of time within the Western world. And this came to a head in the philosophy of modernism, where objectivism was privileged, and objectivism was privileged to such an extent that subjectivism was completely suppressed. You, in the process of your research or writing your research paper, were constantly asked to deny, your own subjectivity. You could not even write your research papers, in first person. You had to use third person. Even while you're writing your research paper, you are saying, the author said, or the researcher said, and so on and so forth. This was the extent to which subject had been suppressed within the modernistic framework. Postmodernism came, and very true to how Western cosmology has operated, it started critiquing the pursuit of objectivism of modernism in various ways. So what did it do in the process? It started privileging subjectivism over objectivism. It could be the subjectivism of a paradigm, or it could be the subjectivism of various thinkers, philosophers, and so on and so forth. This is what you encounter in the postmodern movement. The postmodern movement is only post to modernism in chronology. In content, it is anti. Which, if you look at my theorems, you will be able to understand. You will be able to see the different binaries that postmodernism is flipping of modernism.
The next of something is always the inverse of the other.
Yeah. So let me give you one more example. There was this mind-body binary in Western cosmology. Mind was privileged, body was suppressed. After the countercultural revolution of the 1960s in the United States, body began to get privileged and mind began to get suppressed. Now, it is basically because, the privileging of body has happened earlier also. It is because of the privileging of body that Western medicine for the longest period of time was body oriented. It looked for the etiology of diseases within the body, even if the disease was psychological in nature. So when psychiatry came, what did psychiatry do? psychiatry started privileging mind over the body, right? So there is this play of binaries that you see there also in these two examples that I spoke about. There is a recent movement, in the Western world, which is that it puts different or two binary halves in a dialectical relationship. So, there are many thinkers that you'll find in the West who will say that there is no absolute objectivism or absolute subjectivism. The nature of reality is the product of the interaction between subject and object, between subjectivism and objectivism. Similarly, alternative medicine, gradually moving into mainstream medicine, is now looking at mind-body medicine, where mind and body are being put in a dialectical relationship. You see? So this is what I meant.
So it's not necessarily conflict, yes, but it is...
This is the ultimate. This is the ultimate, that this is the maximum to which...
At best, it is dialectical.
Yes, at best it is dialectical,
And at worst, where all it can
exactly
stretch into.
And the interesting part is that the discussion of a dialectical relationship between, two binary halves began in Europe after Europe came in contact with India.
So there is a contribution, potential contribution.
I would say at this point in time, it's a hypothesis as far as I am concerned. It's a thesis. But because I have not produced any writing on this subject, I will leave it at the level of hypothesis.
But it's an important point. So the Theorems 5's contribution is that it puts an upper limit to the positive outcomes of the relationship between a binary when they are not transcended. And when they are transcended, we know what happens. There is absolute complete harmony, and you don't even consider it as a binary anymore. So you operate from a much higher plane when you transcend. That's what we see in Indian society, because there are enough number of communities which can be thought of as being in a binary, but yet on the ground they're in a reasonable relative harmony. I'm not discounting, skirmishes. Neither am I discounting conflicts in the past. But transcendence helps communities move into a configuration where they attain a reasonable kind of harmony.
Yeah. See, I would say that, that this is a much larger topic where the transcendence of binaries, or rather the transcendence and inclusion of binaries, within our own thought, will have to be discussed in considerable detail and with a lot of meticulous research. So at this point in time, as far as I am concerned, I will veer away, from that discussion, because this book of mine is not going into what the Indian society is like. It is talking about how the binaries have operated in the Western world and what are the consequences in representation that we as Indians have encountered because of the operation of binaries. So I will remain focused on that realm only. We'll
leave that for a future research.
Yes, absolutely. And future discussion. I'm sure that, that we'll come back and unfold this topic that you have touched upon with greater detail.
Fair. While I'm excited about that possibility, but I think we have to leave that for proper research and theorization around that. So let's move to the Theorem 6, Professor. If a thinker or a philosophical school has not transcended the binaries, or put the binary halves into a dialectical relationship, then the entire thought of the thinker or the school can be understood by identifying various binaries that are operational in them. So, this is interesting because if it is not in a dialectic, then it is itself operating in several binaries. So that means it is generating some dialectic within or generating some conflict in the worst case. It will be found that the binary halves that are privileged and the binary halves that are suppressed will coalesce. So this we see very clearly. For instance, if there are binaries A slash B slash C slash D, E slash E, F and G slash H, and then A, C, E, G are privileged, then B, D, F, H are suppressed. Then A, C, E, G will coalesce to form a conglomerate, whereas B, D, F, H will congregate to form a complex. While one could have predicted it, if people who study mathematics and patterns will, very intuitively agree with this theorem, it's important that it is also seen on the ground in the Western civilization. That is, if within a thought system, if ABCD are privileged, EFGH are suppressed, then there is a natural clique that gets formed. So a higher order relationship gets formed within the first four and the second four. Can you give some examples to understand this and relate to it better? And I'm also wondering if this kind of a dialectic got generated between the West and India through James Mill's work also. Do we see any evidence in Mill's work also in this?
So let me come to the first part of the question. Let's take three binaries: man, woman, reason, emotion, soul, body. For the longest period of time, what is it that you have found privileged? Man, reason, soul. What are the binary halves that have been suppressed? Woman, emotion, body. For the longest period of time, man, reason and soul, were conflated. And woman, body and emotion were conflated. And that is why, as women were suppressed within the Western world, they were conflated with emotion and body. You see? So the brutalization of women happened to such an extent because of their conflation with body and emotions. For the longest period of time, the Western world considered, women without reason. That's a reality, and it's basically because of such kinds of representation that the feminist revolution happened, and we need to recognize that.
So this is important in many ways, because it's you can imagine James Mill extracting out various elements of Indian civilization and collectively putting all of them in the savage category without exploring its civilizational utility, isn't it? So do you see that in Mill's work?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a section, I would actually want you to look into the last section of chapter 3, where I'm describing, how James Mill describes the Hindu people.
Hindus as hierarchical, oppressive.
Yes. So let's take, the various binaries one at a time. Hierarchy versus equality is a binary. As James Mill began the movement to create equality within his extremely hierarchical society, what is it that he did? He projected hierarchy onto the Hindu civilization, to the Indian civilization. Another binary, emancipation versus oppression, right? He began to think of the British society as emancipated society and the Hindu society as an oppressed society. So let's get it.
We'll complete this.
Exactly.
Women abusers.
Exactly.
Effeminate.
Women abusers, which means that that the Indian people were women abusers, whereas the British people, were respectful of women, which is completely untrue. The women in the time period in which Mill was writing, were brutally suppressed.
So
if they were not suppressed, the feminist revolution would not have.
It's interesting, as you have already rightly put, all the negatives that Mill wanted to expel from the British society, he has blamed it on the Indian society and coalized them.
They have color, yeah.
And that comes from his own binary sets.
Right.
Of ABCD and EFGH.
If you just read,
effeminate, inhuman, villainous, timid, weak, cowardly, lazy, oppressive, and timid and weak going together. It's interesting. Cowardly, lazy, penurious, greedy, filthy, superstitious, and fatalistic. Everything that he wanted to expel from the British society.
And all the binary halves that were suppressed. In his imagination, in his thinking. They were coalesced and projected onto the Hindu people.
So that this coalition is important, because that is where a collective set gets blamed onto the civilization.
Absolutely.
Let's come to the final theorem, and then we'll touch upon some of the questions that we kind of did not. When a thinker or a school subscribing to the Enlightenment encounters a non-Western culture or civilization, he, she, or it projects on it all the binary halves that have been suppressed. I repeat, when a thinker or a school subscribing to the Enlightenment encounters a non-Western culture or civilization, it looks like this is the most operating theorem. He, she, or it projects on it all the binary halves that have been suppressed, which is what we just observed, in when we were reading out the set. When a thinker or school subscribing to Romanticism meets a non-Western civilization or culture, he, she, or it projects on it the privileged halves of the various binaries that are operational in the paradigm of approach. So we already saw that. That means that when Mill encountered India, so which is a non-Western culture, he had to project on it the binary halves that have been suppressed.
Yeah, that's right. So all the binary halves in his writing that you will find that he was suppressing are getting projected onto India. And why do I say this? Mill was a product of University of Edinburgh, which was the hub of Scottish Enlightenment when Mill was a student there. The German Romantics, or the Romantics in general, had a different way of projecting. They would project onto India the binary halves which they were privileging.
So they wanted to look us in a positive vein.
Yeah. Yes.
And that was a necessity of their own dialectic over there.
Yeah, their own social condition, their own desires, their own imagination. The thing to recognize is that they were also misrepresenting India. So in India at this point in time, you find many Indian thinkers, Hindu thinkers, sort of quoting the German romantics, saying, "Oh, the German said this and the German said that," in positive terms. But these are not positive terms, because once again, as S.N. Balagangadhar said, that when a Westerner talks about India,
he's talking about himself or his
he's talking more about himself or his civilization than he's talking about India. This is a profound statement.
It's a profound statement, and I find it very interesting that the 7 theorems that you have elucidated are not just in consistency with it, but are elaborating it. They are laying it out in a very fine detail, and that Dr. Balagangadhara's statement is not, just an imagination, because now we have in front of us an elaboration of how that is true and a possibility of building over it.
Yeah. So while I bring my own originality into this, I'm also advancing Balu's thought in my Indian Post-Colonial Theory, and that is something that needs to be recognized. There is no binary between me and Balu, not at all. I go off from where he has left, at least in reconceptualizing India studies.
Yeah, you're actually arriving at it from a totally different direction, independently, but in the process,
I am
also identifying several, new things. For instance, the transcendence.
Yes.
In my opinion, that is the most important contribution of this book. It's one thing to deconstruct James Mill. It is another thing to explain the distortions of James Mill. It's another thing to explain why James Mill is distorting in terms of his own civilizational realities. But in the process, identifying the most important strength of our civilization also, and viewing the whole thing from our lens rather than from another lens.
Yes.
So what is the role played by transcendence in the dynamic of a civilization?
Yeah.
Is what is the true contribution of this book.
Thank you.
Because it is one thing to this book, that contribution will not end with this book. James Mill's discourse and its deconstruction probably will end this book. But in the process, a theory has been created that is productive enough and is potent enough to explain various other dimensions of the civilization and recognize today in India, there are several Hindu thinkers. I won't say thinkers, but there are several Hindus who recognize and appreciate the culture, but do not understand or acknowledge the value that transcendence has played in creating this culture. I think this book not only recognizes but lays it out in a very productive way to take it forward. So that's an important contribution. That's actually what attracted me to the book. But I'll come to my final question.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to your comment, which is that this has become possible because, by the grace of the divine, I am very strongly situated and located in our yogic cosmology. And when I pursued this yogic cosmology, despite the fact that I have my strong practice in the tradition of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo, I have gone into all the various paramparas that you have and have studied the paramparas as a good student. And that has given me this location where I am able to talk about the difference between the Indian civilization and the Western civilization, without being jingoistic about it.
Important.
It's a matter of description. Seeing how different things are, and having an exposition based on that. And I personally feel that because of the strong influence that the Western civilization is wielding on the Indian civilization at this point in time, which includes the colonial discourse that India has been subjected to, a work like this will be instrumental in decolonizing India's studies in order to resurrect the Indian knowledge systems and help us look at India from its own distinct lens. The statement can be made very casually, but it will take a lot of effort. And why do I say that it will take a lot of effort? Mind gets colored in the context in which it finds itself. The Indian mind is surrounded by Western cosmology and the colonial discourse. So our minds are almost thoroughly westernized and colonized. We will need to decondition ourselves in order to get to the mind of our ancients. And this was the reason why the ancients in the past, beginning with Nagarjuna, developed very sophisticated deconstructive techniques that was essentially to decondition the mind so that the mind could be deconstructed and transcended in order to experience deeper realities. So this is very much, in the tradition, and even our own deconstructivists have recognized that it is very difficult to deconstruct the mind, and that is why it's an inner process. It's a yogic process where you look at the conditioning of your mind over and over again to really understand the coordinates of your own thinking in order to transcend it and in order to understand what the thought process of our ancient sages has been, who laid the foundation of the Indian civilization.
So, I can, in a light vein, I can say that James Mill is Nimitta, but we'll go to Nagarjuna.
Yes, absolutely.
So that's the journey that we need to undertake. And as you were talking about cosmology, I was just imagining how my own reading of the cosmology in Puranas, especially in Bhagavata, how it helped me appreciate your 7 theorems. I could relate to that very quickly, and suddenly it offered me an array of lens to look at the entire book in a very different way. So let's come to the final question. It appears a little bit of pulling the leg, but it's not. It's an important question. We are now talking about a civilization that transcends and a civilization where the transcendence is not there. There is a potential formation of binary here, and by our own theory that we have studied, we have to transcend that also. So how do you respond to this? How do we look at this? How do we not become a victim of our own theory, or how do we transcend a paradox or a contradiction that is emerging from our own theory?
If you only look at the differences and not privilege one over the other, we will not fall into the binary trap.
This is an important message to all Hindu thinkers and activists of today.
Yes.
That these binaries
Yes.
are not to be stuck with, or we should not closely associate ourselves with any of these binaries,
No,
while differentiating the two civilizations as well.
In fact, in order to see that you are not falling into the binary trap, look at the theorems on binaries and see, are you or can you be put, in any of those theorems or any or more of the theorems as you are discussing the Indian civilization and the Western civilization.
Fantastic.
If you start privileging one over the other, if you invert the binary, you are basically doing the same
Operating
thing.
the same thing.
To which you have been subjected.
So thank you for that insight, Professor. I think it's an important reminder for all the Hindu thinkers and activists on the ground that whatever binaries we see, while we recognize the dialectic or the conflict, we also always have to figure out ways and means of transcending. Now you see that in the way the Pandavas operate. In the minds of the Kauravas, it is always a binary, but not in the minds of the Pandavas and Sri Krishna. So they are always trying to transcend that. And even after everything, Yudhishthira, does not operate in that binary. So that's a reminder for ourselves. And it's not about just being good. It's about being right. And that is the only way in which resolution can happen. So this is a good reminder, in your final note. With that, we come to the end of this beautiful, truly exploratory conversation of what binaries mean to us. And first thing is important to recognize that there is a binary, and then in the process of transcending it, we also integrate it. So the theory is complete over there. And while you and others will develop this theory further, now I clearly see that in our society. As an observer, I can make that comment, if not as an academic. I eagerly look forward to how this theory will be received by the scholarly fraternity, thinkers, academics. And I also look forward to where you will go from here with this theory. I'm sure this has already there are many offshoots of both this theory, and there is a lot more opportunity space to apply and develop this further. So obviously with this book you have arrived in a very big way on our contemporary scenario, because as you said, James Mill is the numero uno distorter of the Indic discourse. Yes. And you have laid it out as to what is the nature of his distortion. Many of us know what is the distortion, but the nature of the distortion is what is the meta that comes out of this, and also there is a theory that comes out of this. Thank you for this phenomenal contribution, and I'm sure the Indian thinkers, scholars, activists, everybody will take this very seriously, and I'm sure in the coming years a lot of discourse will get generated. And I'm very eagerly looking forward to others also being deconstructed. We haven't deconstructed John Stuart Mill, son of James Mill, who is equally important, rather equally devastating, and several others are there. And in the process, hopefully we will begin to understand our own thinkers also. We need to get there.
And in order to facilitate that process, we would want to tell the viewers that this book can be downloaded for free from the website of Springer. So go to the website of Springer, look for Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, a Francophone post-colonial analysis, and you will get the entire book in PDF as well as Kindle versions. You will be able to download the book for free. You can also go to a printer, but by that I mean a printer associated with the computer people. Take a printout of the book, get it bound, and read it. I would really love your time, for I want to emphasize that this book has been written for the Indian civilization and also for the world civilization, because I definitely do want the Western world to stop their projections on India and begin to see what India actually has been and what it is and what it is going to be in the future. So thank you very much, Shivakumar ji, for this opportunity.
Thanks. And the link of this book will be there in this podcast description also, so people can download it from there. Thank you once again. Namaskar. And with that, we come to the end of this podcast on binaries and the necessity to transcend binaries, which is part of this book, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, written by Professor Kundan Singh and Krishna Maheshwari. Every week, we bring you an IKS Changemaker, his or her thought and how it is Dharma in action through Indian knowledge systems. Please join us in our next podcast as well. And until then, Namaskar. Hope you enjoyed this exploratory conversation.